Hello, friends. This is the Grow Podcast, and I'm Wendy Jo, and this is Ashley.
Hey, Wendy, how are you today?
I'm doing really well. I feel very happy today, a little floaty, maybe.
Mm. You know what? Actually, I've been feeling like that all day today. I just had the best thing ever. It was a donut with granola on it.
Ooh.
I had such a good time with it.
You and your sweets, you did try to make it a little healthier, maybe. Add a little more fiber.
Right?
That works. I like it. Uh,
Okay.
so we're talking about religious symbols and culture and how that all kind of impact us as human beings. Um, so this is kind of an intricate topic, but I think later in the show you have a guest where you kind of delve in a little more. But there are so many symbols in in every culture, and some of them are religious based, some of them aren't. But we can kind of get confused with each other if the symbols overlap in some way, you know?
Yeah. I feel like the symbols are the way that we communicate, the way that we tell our story and our history, because I don't think symbols mean anything until we give it meaning,
Oh, that's true.
you know?
Mhm.
And so I'm really interested to hear about our guest coming up because I believe she's into marketing. She creates symbols for a living
Oh,
almost. You know what I mean? Like that's what marketing really is to create something that imprints on the mind so that way you feel more motivated to buy. And knowing that about her, I'm really curious about her journey and how that became a passion of hers. And if you ever get to meet her, it really is truly a passion for her.
I think that's what life is all about, finding what we're passionate about. And it is true that a symbol can, um, the mind can go off in a infinite direction by looking at a certain symbol. Sometimes because it's something that was imprinted on us in childhood. Like I'm thinking about a cross, right?
Yes, I was thinking that too.
Yeah, the cross. So they used to carry the cross into battle,
Mm.
and it wasn't necessarily a religious symbol as it started out. It was kind of a symbol of power and strength,
Yeah.
But I don't know when people look at it now if they have those images.
Yeah, I think it varies in more modern day. You know what? And here's the other thing, like in 2023, 24-ish, like we're in a place where we all have very, very different ideologies and have different experiences with different types of symbols. I feel like back when we're talking about war times, maybe early 1800s or whatever, I feel like there was a little bit more cohesion across America, across, you know, in different cultures where right now you could be an American and think completely different things about one word or one symbol.
Mhm.
And, who knows where that's going to come. Usually it comes in the form of a debate.
Well, I'm really excited to hear what our guest has to say about her background and symbols and culture, religion, all of it.
Coming up next is Heather. In my interview with her, we're going to learn a lot. Have you ever noticed that when we talk about religious symbols, is often associated with spirituality? The symbols serve as some sort of visual representation of people's belief system, maybe even their values and their principles as well. An example of a common religious symbol is the cross. Many of the symbols that are associated with religion have a big part in our belief systems, how we worship, our cultural identity, and they encapsulate stories that transcend time. My question, though, is if we already know that religion and spirituality are not the same thing, how come we associate religious symbols with spirituality? Have you ever thought about consuming cannabis but was worried about smoking it or eating it? Or maybe you just want to give your lungs a break or you had a really bad edible experience. As a healthcare professional, I am very conscious of the multiple ways of dosing your medicine. One of the ways that you can consume cannabis is through a transdermal patch. This is not often talked about. The cool thing about transdermal is that there is a 97% bioavailability to this type of consumption method. Now, the problem is finding a trusted resource to facilitate your consumption. And guess what? I found a product that I support. It's called Synergy Skinworks. It's a cannabis delivery system that works effortlessly since the medicine goes where the blood flows. Patch on, peace out. I am really, really excited because I have a special guest with me. Her name is Heather. She is an amazing mentor to me and a spiritual, I don't know the word. Like, how do you qualify yourself spiritually?
I don't really have a term for it because I don't subscribe to a specific faith. I kind of just do my own thing, but it's still a little nebulous. But I'm open. Let's call it that.
I like it. I like it. So then if we don't call it anything, how would you describe it?
I would describe it as believing in a fundamental goodness in the universe. And everybody has their own definition of what goodness means to them, what happiness means to them, and that everyone's path to that state of happiness and goodness is their own. And each path is valid as long as you are respecting the goodness and paths of others.
Yes. Well, I think you define good in such a beautiful way.
Thank you.
A lot of people see things as good or bad on the spectrum. And it's like, well, if it's not bad, then it has to be good. And if it's not good, then it definitely has to be bad. And so I think the idea of respecting where everybody is on that spectrum and what they believe and where they are and what their journey looks like, I think is the important part about spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
And when we get into some of these conversations about what it looks like for each one of us, I think a lot of people, a lot of times want to associate it with religion.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a false dichotomy in a sense to have to tie spirituality to religion, because at its core, and if you look at it historically, 9 times out of 10, religion isn't about necessarily helping you find happiness. It's about centralizing control. It's about the stories that help to organize society, give it structure. But the sad byproduct of that is it also means it's a giant lever for control that inevitably is used for ill intent by humans. Whereas spirituality is the core of that, and it's about your personal relationship with whatever the universe is and how it functions, and your path to that sense of goodness.
Man, you are my kind of person.
Yay! I thought so.
Yes. And for a long time, and the reason why I say that, for a long time, I felt a certain kind of way about the structure that was created. Generally tend to be rebellious in a lot of ways. So as soon as I start to see structure, I want to go in the opposite direction. And this area is no different. And so I did have a lot of like negative feelings towards the idea of religion for a long time. And until I realized that, that structure actually does serve a purpose for a lot of people. Right. Yeah. And it's necessary, because otherwise they wouldn't have access to anything that resembles spirituality at all. And without that direction, your life just spins in circles and there is nothing. So I really appreciate that. So let me ask you this, how did you develop your ideas around spirituality?
It was a long process. So I was raised in a rather strict Christian household. My parents are Mormon, so that's quite a far cry from where I am now. But my parents were converts, and my mom always had her own kind of unique ideas on what it meant to be Mormon that I don't think really line up with what Mormon actually is. But she raised us with this really common thread that's like a cliche in our house, but I love it. her approach to life in general, but even spirituality and religion, is follow the logic train through to the station. Whatever you're doing in life, follow the logic train all the way through to the station. And it's all about not accepting the first answer necessarily, but thinking through, okay, if I accept A, what does that mean for B, C, D, all the way through to the end of the alphabet? And it trains you to think not just about yourself, but about how your actions then reverberate in your own life, affect the people around you and the people around them until broader society, out into the universe. And that is one thing I really like about Mormonism, is that, for instance, their approach to the afterlife is really unique. If people aren't familiar with that, it's the idea that who you are as a person continues after you die, and there is a path to eventually becoming a god yourself, and it's all one big giant circle of learning and growth, and that's just the next stage. And I really liked that idea, that there's a point to what we're learning on Earth, then it's a growth pattern and a growth state. I love that part of it. But then where I bristled in the Mormon church was the hypocrisy. Where
what's that little thing?
Just a little thing where, like, you profess to believe in one thing and yet you take a step that is radically diametrically opposed to that thing. So the hypocrisy got me in so many ways. Like, I had really big problems with how they profess to respect women, and yet there are so many ways in which women are not treated equally. And this is not a judgment by any means on anyone who is still Mormon. I love my parents. They're still Mormon, all of that. But for me personally, I saw a lot of places where the logic train didn't follow through to the station.
Yeah.
And so I took the bits of it that spoke to me, of that ultimate goodness. And then I started to fill in the gaps where the logic train didn't follow through to the station. And it wasn't until I was finally about 12 or 13 that I started to realize there are a lot of gaps here. Okay, what do I do now? And then finally by 19, I was like, okay, I'm done. I'm doing my own thing now.
Yeah. You were fairly young when you realized that. I think I was a little bit slow to come around.
Everybody's on their own journey. That's okay.
And so, at 12 or 13, for me, at least, I think I was very, like, selfish in a sense. Like, I just wanted to do what felt good. Like, I was really into the physical world. Like, what piece of candy can I eat today? How can I figure out how to get in trouble? That kind of thing. And so I think it's, like, amazing that at 12 or 13, you were so profound. So is there anything that, like, inspired that, or is it just something natural to you? I don't know.
I think it's somewhat natural in how my brain works, I think. Because I'm really drawn to the two extremes of thought of what's the tiny, tiny detail, and then what's the really, really big impact at the end. And I love the two extremes there, and the swing between them and the balance between them. But then it was also in large part due to how I was raised. My mom is incredibly philosophical and artistic and always challenged those big questions. And then my dad is very analytical, logical, and I mean, not to say my mom isn't, but you know what I mean? Like, their two focuses were very philosophy and art, and then structure and how do we do things. And so those kinds of deep philosophical conversations were always happening in the house. So definitely being raised in that contributed a lot.
So one question I have for you, like, I mentioned rituals. What are some practices that support your spirituality?
I kind of don't really have a bunch, really. Which is interesting because ritual does mean a lot. It's what gives your life structure. It's a way to commune with other people. It's a way to reinforce the things you believe in. But there is a dark side to it where it can also be an instrument of control. For instance, the psychology of speak and repeat is really fascinating to me, or the practice of singing hymns, where something energetically and physically within your own body changes when you are standing in the same space. Someone says something to you and you stand amongst the crowd and everyone repeats the same thing back.
Yeah.
It is technically a brainwashing technique. It is a way to your heart rhythms start to align with the other people in the group. You become more suggestible. Different parts of your brain light up. And that can be incredibly powerful and lead to heightened levels of awareness of your own being and your place within a community. Or it can be really dark and lead you down some really dangerous paths where you give your own sense of self over to someone to control. And I really bristle at that. And to me, I think there's not enough awareness among people about how to identify the dividing line between, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? And it's how a lot of people fall into cults and abusive relationships and all sorts of really terrible stuff. So I think for instance, I've done a lot of work back in a previous stage of my career. I worked with a lot of people leaving the Church of Scientology and deprogramming them coming out of the cult. Yeah. And I think that experience has definitely altered my own approach to ritual and spiritual practice. So that was a very long-winded way of getting around to answering your question. Sorry.
No, it's okay. It was important to say.
I spend a lot of time doing what I just call being bored.
Yeah.
Because I find that's when I have my best ideas. And doing things where my hands and my eyes and my cognitive spatial reasoning can be taken over so that I don't have to think about that consciously, but I can just let my imagination wander and think about deep things and make connections between disparate ideas that I wouldn't have otherwise. Because when you spend so much of your time thinking about, okay, what am I physically doing? What am I looking at? It occupies so much of your brain, you don't have time for those deeper thoughts.
Yeah.
So it's one reason I love video games. They're part of my spiritual practice, I guess. Because I'm going to count that. Yeah, video games is religion. I am into that. But it's one thing I love about video games because it occupies so much of my brain that it frees it up to focus on other things. So it's, I guess, a kind of meditation in a weird, roundabout, sacrilegious kind of way.
How do you develop yourself spiritually? Like, what does that like growth process look like for you?
For me, I think it started where I think the very first seed of my mind expanding beyond what I was taught in Mormonism was kind of a funny experience and not necessarily something I would think of as like a big spiritual awakening. My dad was in the Air Force, and when I was 12, we got to move to Italy. And it was amazing. And getting that experience of living in a different culture, speaking a different language, and seeing the ways where you may look familiar. Italian culture may seem perfectly familiar. I mean, it's not that foreign to us as far as American exposure to culture. And yet the ways different cultures tell stories can be so drastically different. And the experience of going somewhere and trying to communicate and realizing there is that barrier. Now that happened along the side of, I think it was about a couple years later, maybe, but the same train of thought of that ability to communicate. One of my favorite bands released a documentary, and they talked about going to perform on a Christmas special in the Netherlands. And they're a gay disco band. They're great. I love them. And they were thrown into a dress rehearsal with no prep. And they were singing their hit song, being wheeled out through a curtain to a stage of a Christmas setup. And they thought, okay, it's Christmas. It's going to be Santa, right? Great. They wheeled out and the entire audience was children in blackface. And they're thinking, oh my heavens, what did we sign up for? How do we get out of here? What the hell is going on?
What?
And they didn't know that in the Netherlands, Santa doesn't have elves. He has children who help him, and they go through the chimney and their faces get covered in soot.
Oh, wow.
Now, back in the back history of Netherlands, there were racist components to it. I have a character named Black Pete that was not great, but it evolved to then become this faces covered in soot. And so to me, it was a mind-blowing moment of thinking, in our culture, in our language, you can have the same image be about something so dark and evil and horrible. And in another culture, it's Christmas, it's happiness, it's joy. The same thing can have so completely and utterly different meanings based on the stories you're told.
Yeah.
And the communication style you were raised in. And that was such a mind-blowing moment for me of realizing, if the universe is run by a perfect, all-knowing, loving creator or creators who recognizes the power of story and the difference in the culture between where we are raised, doesn't it make sense that if that creator wants you to get to an ultimate destination, that he's going to tell you the instructions of how to get there in a story that makes sense to you?
Yeah.
And a language that makes sense to you. So what you were talking about every religion having the same core things, but dressed up in different characters, different names, different titles. To me, that's God understanding your culture, your language, and what speaks to you, and how your brain is wired to process stories, and then giving you instructions in a manner you are most equipped to understand.
Yeah.
And then that's the core of every religion. But then along the way in history, human beings come along with their negative intentions, twist things, manipulate things, and use it as a tool for power. But the root at the core there is instructions in your language to get where you need to be a happier, better person.
So, I think that story about the Netherlands and that person, and like the stories relating to the symbology, that means a lot to me, just because I've spent so much time with you recently, in what you do for your work. And so I want you to share that. Like, what is it that you do? Because I have a feeling, just based on what you told me, that it directly ties into like even how you move in spiritually and in your work. It's combined. It is who you are.
Yeah. I hadn't really thought of that before. Yeah, it does. So what I do for work is I run a company called CMO, which is your friendly automated CMO. And essentially what I do is help early stage startup founders tell their stories. But to me, stories are encompassed in a variety of different mediums, different tools that help you to convey who you are, what you do, and why it matters. And I split that between your branding, which is your logo, your color scheme, your fonts. It's the visual way you tell your story of who you are. Then there's your marketing materials and your pitch decks, what you do verbally and written to tell that story to your customer or your investor, to help them understand, again, those three core pillars: who you are, what you do, and why it matters. And to me, it's utilizing the power of story to help people not only advance their own economic opportunity and also the economic opportunity of everyone they hire, but then to make a difference in the world. I do believe that companies can be a massive force for good, just like any other tool in the world. It can be either good or bad. But I see a lot of hope and a lot of innovation in startup founders working really hard to solve big problems for people, and while at the same time hiring people and building up their economic opportunity. And I think that's a beautiful thing.
For sure. For sure. Yeah, I love that. And so you said you didn't notice that, but like as soon as you started telling me that story, I was like, bing, 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 like.
Yeah, I do think storytelling has definitely been a through line throughout my entire career. And like if you look at my resume, and I haven't even put all of it on LinkedIn yet because I've done so many weird random things, but the through line is definitely how storytelling and design come together to make things happen. And religion is storytelling and visual iconography to help people hopefully become better people. And like you said, I think the important thing to remember when it comes to spirituality is there are 1,000,001 paths to being a better person and having a good impact on the world and finding peace within yourself and your place in the universe. And please, I don't want anyone to feel restricted that they have to follow the path that their parents did or their community does, because the world is so much bigger and broader and more beautiful than that. I mean, every path is valid. Every path is good as long as you are using it to be a better person and have a better impact on the world. So find your path, explore, have fun.
Yes, I love that. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate everything that you brought to this conversation.
Hey there, Wendy Jo, co-host of the Grow podcast. Also, Wendy Edge, occupational therapist. And I wanted to tell you about my new business where I'm combining the principles of occupational therapy, coaching, and spirituality, and wellness, of course. On the website, you'll see that I'm doing Osho Zen card readings, spiritual coaching, spirit paintings, and so much more. So if you want, check it out, edgecoachingandconsulting.com.
Have you heard of the Cannabis Nursing School? It's a place where cannabis nursing, entrepreneurship, and spirituality meet. The High Align Tribe is waiting for you, and it's so easy to find. CannabisNursingSchool.com.
And we're back. What a great interview. She was really sharing a lot of her experience, and I don't know very much about the Mormon faith, but I do think when religions are more of an orthodoxy, it can kind of go to an extreme where there's potential for abuse and just a lot of strictness. It kind of like takes away individuality in many ways. I mean, that's my take. I know someone else may feel differently, but it was interesting to hear her perspective for sure.
Yeah, well, it's actually quite eye-opening for me. I don't know a lot about the Mormon faith either. So just hearing that the experience from her point of view, in a lot of ways, I felt like we resonated on the same idea, even though I didn't know as much about her experience and she doesn't know as much about mine. But for some reason, we still connected on some very key thoughts. At the end of the day, we pray, and maybe we don't call it prayer, maybe, the rituals, all those kind of things. One moment that was actually iconic was when she talked about playing video games as part of her ritual.
You could relate to that.
Oh my gosh.
I love, what you said is very poignant, and I think that we all have to remember that, though we may be very different in our backgrounds, whether it's religion or how we were raised, where we were raised, we're all human and we have that thread of humanity. And what shows up is more how we're the same rather than how we're different. And I think in today's climate, especially here in the US, but maybe even worldwide, I think people forget that, we're all part of this one humanity. And the more we embrace the differences, I think we also reveal the similarities.
Yeah, we just got to dig deep. And I think it's all sourced in love.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, what a great place to end. It's all sourced in love. Have a great week, everyone.
Bye.